conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, I'll be digging into the floor debate on House Bill 2. That was the school choice constitutional amendment that passed on Wednesday. There's been much hoopla regarding the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Horse Racing Commission getting moved over to being under the Department of the Agricultural Commissioner. But before we dig into those two stories, the budget has passed the Senate. I've dug into the budget quite a bit on this show, kind of going through a lot of it. And when I first kind of dug through it, I asked the question, where are we getting all the money from? Because when we take a look at our peak year budget, so keep in mind that our legislature makes a budget every 2 years. And every 2 years, the first year budget that they put together is always significantly bigger than the second year. For an example, when we look last year, we see that the first year budget was around $54 billion or so. And then the second year budget went down to around $41 billion. And so moving into these next 2 years, their first year is going to be bigger again, and then their second year is going to be lower. But when we look at the peak year spending, when we saw the first bill leaving the House, they said, it's got to go over to the Senate. They just threw a lot in there. They'll take out some things for sure. But when it left the House, it was a $72.7 billion budget, $72.7 billion. That's almost a $20 billion increase. So I asked the question, where are we getting this money from? Because federal funding has largely gone down. Remember those COVID funds, that COVID money that the federal government was handing out to all these states? That's largely gone away. And so now these states, for some reason, our state has found $20 billion more in spending and revenues to spend. And I asked that question to several representatives. Couldn't get an answer. I even asked that question to a representative that's on the committee that makes the budget. Couldn't get an answer. I talked to the people in LRC that help make this budget, and I asked the question, where's this $20 billion coming from? And those who listen to the show know I read through their message, which was basically, it could come from a lot of places. But my question is where? Where do we have $20 billion more in spending at that we suddenly can just blow? Where's that money coming from? And so I thought, well, maybe we'll see that the Senate pares it down and realizes, look, we really don't have $20 billion more to spend because, we hear talk of this rainy day fund. We have more rainy day fund money than ever. That's only like $3-4 billion. It's not $20 billion. So where's it coming from? Well, when the budget has passed out of the Senate, so when it left the House, it was $72.752 billion. Well, now it's $74.605 billion. They found another $2 billion to spend in this first year on one-time projects. And yet we still haven't answered the question of now where is the $20 billion coming from? Now we've added on another $2 billion. Where is this money coming from? Because money can only come from one place in the state. It's either coming from your pocket somehow, some way, or it's coming from the federal government, which is also your pocket, but you could say it's dispersed out. We get it from other states if it's federal funding, so you can't look at it the same way. So we do ask, where is that money coming from? And I still don't have an accurate answer for you. I can't explain to you also why on peak year funding we're spending nearly 50% more money, the largest budget we've ever had. This is supposedly a conservative legislature. This is a Republican governance that believes in smaller government. At least that's what they claim. But smaller government naturally means less spending, because if you want the governor to do less, well then that governor, or not just the governor, if you want the government as a whole to do less, then the government needs to spend less. But that's not what we're seeing from this Republican legislature. We're seeing the largest budget we've ever had by almost $20 billion with no explanation where it's coming from. This isn't conservative. This isn't fiscally responsible. And that's what's funny. They'll tell you this is the most conservative, fiscally responsible budget we've ever passed. When they pass the budget, I guarantee you they will say that because they said it last year too. And when you point out the fact, how is it that spending $20 billion more than we did 2 years ago, a fiscally conservative move, they will stare at you with dead eyes and stammer. Unless, of course, enough of leadership listens to my show that they end up coming up with a talking point to explain how they're spending $20 billion more and how that's somehow still super duper uber conservative. And when I bring this up, people say, well, Andrew, where did you want to spend it at? Give it back to us. How about that? If there's $20 billion out there, if we've amassed that through our colleges and universities, well, that means they're obviously charging too much in tuition. If we've amassed that through our boards and commissions and licensing fees that has been put into accounts and now is just getting okayed for them to go ahead and spend, well, then that has to be something that we obviously dig into and we look at, right? That obviously has to be something that we say, oh, well, they're charging way too much for this as a whole. And then when we look at the budget, not to mention that this budget going forward puts us $3.5 billion more in debt because it has $3.5 billion more in bonds that's allowed to be issued. That is debt. Now, how does that fully even affect you? Well, I recently got this viewer question sent to me where they wanted me to follow up on something I've talked about a little bit on the show, but they wanted me to follow up on where is the sales tax cuts at? This is what they said to me. Did we get the old bait and switch with the income tax reduction? I mean, not that many years ago, we didn't pay sales tax on labor, and now we do, which affects me greatly, vet, landscape, mechanic. I pay a ton more in taxes now, yet it seems there's a stall in the income tax reduction. Where does this little gem sit? That was their question to me. Anna, I thank you for that question, and I want to make sure I answer that for you. Ann, not Anna. And I want to answer that for you. So this year you saw a 0.5% income tax reduction, but next year you won't because they spent too much money last year. See, there's two steps in this. They, quote unquote, broadened the tax base by taxing things like labor, as she's pointing out, by taxing business-to-business services such as marketing. So now, you buy billboards, you got to pay a 6% sales tax on that. And they increased their revenues. And so they stated in their plan, if we went over this marker of revenues, which keep in mind that even if we hit all the markers, it still requires the state to be bringing in nearly 70% more in tax revenues, which is increased spending. That is larger government actions because obviously you need 70% more increase in taxation in order to have a 70% increase. Now, they'll claim we're just going to grow massively in population, but I think that's a load of bullhickey. But so they had revenue markers, and then they also had a rider that said that they had to be able to afford the cut as well. So the surplus, they have to hit revenue markers, and then the surplus pass that revenue marker of extra tax dollars collected has to exceed it, so much so to the point that when they make the income tax cut, that the income tax cut is offset, the amount that they're going to lose is offset by the surplus over the prior year budget. Well, last year, they spent so much that even though we hit the revenue marker that they laid out, the surplus wasn't enough because they can't keep their spending under control. And here we have another budget going up $21 billion over peak year spending, another massive increase. And they're going to try to sell us on this tax deduction will eventually happen. It seems like all we did was get a net tax increase and that is what happened because we haven't seen this massive population growth yet. But yet they somehow are finding $21 billion to spend. How about you return the money to the people and do something actually conservative when it comes to fiscal responsibility? But instead, we have a legislature that's full of people that can't wait to spend our money like it's burning a hole in their darn pockets. The only difference between them and Democrats is a difference of opinion of what to spend it on. Well, coming up after this, we'll be digging into that House Bill 2, the School Choice Amendment floor debate. We'll have that after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Of course, I'm your host, Andrew Cooperrider. We'll see you in a few short minutes.
Shipping can make or break a sale, so optimize how you ship your orders with ShipStation. They make it easy to automate and manage orders no matter how big your business grows. And they might even be able to help reduce shipping and warehouse costs. So optimize and keep up your momentum for growth with ShipStation. Sign up for your free 60-day trial now at ShipStation.com and use the code POD. That's ShipStation.com with the code POD.
And you are back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Of course, I'm your host, Andrew Cooperrider. So House Bill 2, which was the school choice constitutional amendment, passed on Wednesday. I covered this in yesterday's show that it passed. I went over the merits of the bill, so on and so forth. Now I wanted to, as I promised, go over what the floor debate was on the House floor. And to start us off, this went on for about 2.5, 3 hours, where basically every single Democrat had to say something. I think only the Republican, the bill's sponsor, and then I think 2 other Republicans said something, but they were generally negative against the bill. So there's only one positive Republican speaker, and then, of course, the person who put forward the bill. And but to start off, we have Chris Fugate, who is a representative out of Eastern Kentucky. And Chris Fugate, he started off his floor comments on House Bill 2 on the school choice amendment. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Question before the body is passage of House Bill 2 is amended by House Committee Substitute 1. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Perry for discussion of the matter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to speak on the bill, please.
Yes, ma'am. Sir.
Thank you. I still am a sir, I reckon. I rise to speak on this bill today and I'll say right up front that I am personally for House Bill 2 because I believe it's the right of every parent to educate their kids in the place where they want to and or need to. However, I cannot support House Bill 2 today because of some issues that I have going on in the 84th District of Perry, Breathitt, and Owsley counties.
So when Chris Fugate says he supports House Bill 2, but he's not voting yes on it today, I actually do believe him that he does support House Bill 2. He's got a brother in Lexington that runs Claysmill Baptist Church, Pastor Fugate, and, he supports school choice. I believe Chris Fugate is somebody who generally supports school choice. So why is he rising up and saying he's against it? Well, he says he's got these issues going on in his district. Now, there's some inside baseball here I'm going to go into here in a bit about what exactly this has to do, but what are those issues he's talking about Eastern Kentucky dealing with? Well, there's been floods in Eastern Kentucky, as many of you remember, that took place, this massive historic once-in-a-century flooding that has took out a lot of schools, housing, and as such. And apparently, a lot of those schools haven't been rebuilt, and it leads to a difficult situation going on within the district in schooling. Let's listen as he kind of lays out just a little clip here of him laying out kind of a crux of an issue he's having.
This morning at 4:45, the bus driver left to go to Saul, which is 11 miles past Buckhorn High School, and the first student got on the bus at around 6 o'clock. To drive from Saul, which in a state police cruiser used to take me 50 minutes to drive with blue lights and siren. And they come to school this morning to drop off kids from Saul all the way in Hazard because Buckhorn is still closed due to the flood. Over $47 million in claims were submitted to FEMA for the rebuilding of the 2 schools that were destroyed. Over 40 million of the 47 million asked for has not yet been approved.
Now, you may be wondering, what exactly does that have to do with a school choice amendment? Because remember, that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about putting a choice on the ballot for voters to ask themselves a question: do I want legislators to now be allowed through the Constitution to go ahead and make a school choice program where charter schools, voucher systems, private schools, where people are able to basically have school choice and not be stuck in just one public school based upon their geographic area. And, really, you're not wrong to ask yourself that, because, what's before the body today, they vote yes on it. Senate votes yes on it. It doesn't even get voted yes on until November. Then once it gets voted yes on in November, assuming it does, it may not, but if it does pass in November, well, now it won't be till next year that they can actually start to begin to make some policies on this. And chances are that may not get hammered out in a year. It may not be exact. It may not be much reaching at all. You're probably looking at more like 4 to 5 years from this point that we actually get a real, full, and complete school choice. And so really talking about a school being taken out that needs to be rebuilt now doesn't have as much to do with this immediate question, the immediate question that's before him. And that's where you got to know your inside baseball. And I'm going to go over a little bit more about kind of why Chris felt called to make those comments. But I do actually want to push back on his claim that this won't help with those issues. Because what is he talking about? He's saying that he's got students driving, basically an hour and a half bus rides to school because schools have been taken out, they haven't been rebuilt, and so they're going to schools much farther away than they normally would have because FEMA hasn't paid out $40 million worth of claims that this district has filed. So one could argue, and I will be the one to argue it, that school choice would help solve this issue. Because he's pointing to the very problem we have with our schools, why our schools are ineffective, why we have issues in our education, and why school choice could be an answer, because the bureaucracy of government sucks. And if we get government out of the way and create a profit incentive, which is what school choice does, it creates a profit incentive to put forward a good, high-quality school, and for some reason they figure out a way to do it at least cheaper. Even if they get the same results, they still do it cheaper. But now there would be obviously a market now in his district, in that area. If you've got all these students riding the bus for an hour and a half, a school choice school could come in that's only 30 minutes down the road or 20 minutes down the road from a lot of these people and be an alternative to having to drive an hour and a half. So that could help solve your bureaucratic problem. So school choice could help you with that. Now, the fact, though, he was talking created a very kind of interesting occurrence, and it really points to the real reason why Fugate was actually saying what he was saying. And so here's like a little part from his talk where Osborne gets on him about talking about things that really don't have to do with what's before the body, the school choice amendment.
But I've never been able to get a definite answer of yes, you're going to get this funding for your school, or no, you're not.
Gentleman from Perry, I would ask that you limit your comments to the bill on the floor.
So he was talking about his issues with his schools, and Osborne pops in and says, look, this doesn't have to do with this bill. And I'm not saying Osborne's exactly wrong, but at the same time, this is why it occurred. Because, I mean, they even towards the end of Fugate's comments, they even cut off Fugate's mic to cut him short. They end up muting his mic and cutting his floor comments short. So what's the conflict between him and Osborne about? Well, Fugate is generally an establishment man. He does what he's asked to do. Well, what's happened here is House Bill 2 wasn't allowed to be discussed in caucus beforehand. You see, he probably would have voted yes on House Bill 2 had he been allowed to discuss in caucus, because he's trying to get this school built. He's not getting any kind of movement on it, he feels. And it's an important thing to his district. And how can he go to his district and say, I voted for school choice, but I can't get you a school bill? And these are the kinds of debates and hash outs and deals, it's kind of the gross part of government, that get made behind closed doors, but they didn't let them debate behind closed doors beforehand. So Fugate has to drag his points out onto the floor. If they had just heard him out behind closed doors, he wouldn't have done that. And they did this because, one, they rushed House Bill 2 through, Once they figured out that this version would get at least 60 votes, they rushed it through committee. They used a special rule to call it to the floor quick. Because, see, there's a rule in the House that amendments have to exist for at least 24 hours in order for them to be allowed to be voted on the floor. However, by rushing through this bill as quickly as they did, quick to committee, quick onto the floor, you couldn't file amendments. They wanted to shut down debate on it because once they knew they had at least their 60 votes, they really didn't care what everybody else needed. And I think to Fugate, that should be a lesson. Stop doing the work of the establishment. Stop being the establishment man. They don't respect you and they don't care, particularly speaking. Once they get their votes, that's all that matters to them. Though there is a good reason for Osborne to want to control this conversation, at least on the floor. But if he didn't want his own caucus to be up in arms about it to a degree, or own members of it, he should have allowed the debate behind closed doors to happen. But he's trying to keep, one, people from organizing, and two, he's trying to, like I said, shut down conversation. The reason why Osborne does kind of have a reason to want to control this conversation, keep it tight, has to do with the fact that why this amendment exists in the first place. We have an amendment on school choice because we can't even begin to have the debate or conversation about vouchers or charter schools because that would have to come after the amendment. And so all day Democrats were trying to talk about vouchers and charter schools, and Osborne would shut them down every time. Talk about the bill. Because you actually, and he's not wrong, you can't actually have that debate on the floor. You can't do it. Because it doesn't matter what the outcome from that is. If the amendment doesn't pass, it's not even an argument worth having. It's like having an argument about what you would do with a country if you're starting over from scratch. Sure, it may be a worthwhile debate for a mental exercise, but it's never going to happen. You're not going to start from scratch. And so stop dreaming about it. It's the same kind of thing. Until this passes, we can't even have a debate about vouchers or school choice. And so I understand him shutting down the Democrats when they tried to do that. But they should have allowed their own caucus, at least, behind closed doors to have a discussion on this, and they didn't. And that's why Fugate stood up and said what he said. Now, I will continue talking about what happened on the floor after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. So before the break, we were talking about House Bill 2 floor debate. We kind of went over some of the opening remarks, and kind of this tone set for it was Osborne was really trying to control this conversation. As Speaker of the House, he has that. Now, I think he was right to make sure they didn't, as I stated priorly, to make sure they didn't talk about things like vouchers and things like charter schools, because though this amendment allows that discussion, allows bills like that to pass, that isn't actually the bill before the table. And so, as I stated in the last segment, there's no reason to have a debate over vouchers or charter schools or anything like that if it doesn't matter what the outcome of it is. Until we know if this amendment passes, we can't even have that conversation, right? About what does school choice in Kentucky actually end up looking like. But if you want to even have that conversation, the people of Kentucky have to take a vote. Now, there was one occurrence, though, where I greatly disagreed with Osborne's ruling on being unable to discuss. At one point, a member started talking about the Sikh formula. Democrats started going into the Sikh formula, and he stated that their comments were out of order because the issue before the body doesn't deal with school funding. But that is completely incorrect, and he shouldn't have shut down debate over specifically how schools are funded. If you want to shut down debate about how public schools need more money, that's fine. That's not really pertinent to the constitutional amendment. You know, I can make that argument for you. You want to shut down debate about charter school success, then let's do that. You want to shut down the debate about school voucher systems and their success, that's worth doing because that's not what's before the body. But talking about overall funding, the Sikh formula, how the funding process would work, I do think that was pertinent and germane to the bill based upon the title of the bill. So the title of the bill, House Bill 2, was an act proposing to create a new section of the Constitution of Kentucky related to education funding. That was the title of the bill. And the Sikh formula is how they fund it. So a conversation about how does the Sikh formula fit into this would be, I think, pertinent to the bill. And it could have offered up opportunities for Republicans to hit back, saying things such as, you're talking about all this funding, but this is voters' dollars, not our dollars. Republicans could hit back and call them elitists, saying that. So you're saying that how we spend voters' money should only be up to us? That we shouldn't put forward a question that would allow the voters to say how they feel on this issue? Because after all, it's their money. Also, practically speaking, outside of saving time, what reason does Osborne have to do this really anyways? Only reason I can think of is bad TV hits, because how many people are going to watch a floor debate about this? Very little. There will be campaigns on both sides where millions of dollars are spent, and this will turn into a conversation about voucher systems and charter schools and how evil they are on one side, and then the right will talk about parental control and point out how much public schools suck, because they do, and how they're a black pit of money, because they are. So what's said on the floor is really unconsequential. So I don't quite understand what Osborne, outside of saving time, what his purpose was of being so tyrannical with keeping them in tight, unless he's just trying to not get bad hits, trying to make sure he can limit the options to say something bad by the bill sponsor, Suzanne Miles. However, these parameters on what they could talk about being forced onto Democrats, while every Democrat still insisting on making some floor speech about it, made Democrats go into some really weird directions. And I think a perfect example of just how weird it got was Pamela Stevenson, representative out of Jefferson County, out of Louisville. And it got a little strange, so we're going to I'll probably stop and start this as we go, kind of digging through it. But let's hear what her floor speech was.
Will the lady yield to a question?
She will yield.
Lady, does this constitutional amendment include an amendment to take slavery out of the Kentucky Constitution?
Lady from Davis.
No, ma'am.
Now, you may be wondering, what does that have to do with schools? And you would be right to wonder that, because I wonder that. I was curious where she was going with that question. If you're curious where she was going with that question, it will take till the end of her speech to even wrap back around to where she says the word slavery again. So she starts off with something that makes no sense at all. But let's hear what her follows. So she asks, is there slavery in the Constitution, in this amendment? Is it taking slavery out of the Constitution? Which, by the way, we'll talk about too, why the word slavery is in the Constitution. And then, does she wrap that back around, though? What's her follow-up here? Let's listen to what her follow-up was.
Why change the Kentucky Constitution? We all believe that every child deserves the opportunity to thrive and to learn. We all know that parents deserve the right to make sure their children can do better than they've done before.
If you're against school choice, you don't actually think that, because obviously a child to do better than they did before would require the ability to, if you went to public schools, you want your kid to do better, you can put them in private schools. But that option isn't available to everyone. But anyways, continue.
You keep saying people have the right to choose, and they do. They've chosen over and over and over again that public monies are for public schools, and every parent has the right to send their kids where they want to send them.
When has any voter chosen that ever? I don't even understand her logic here. She says they've told us time and time again that they want public money to only go to public schools. When has that ever been a question on the ballot? They have never said that. In fact, I would argue that the people have indicated that they actually do want school choice based on the fact that they send more and more Republicans to the legislature. The Democrats are in the minority. They send more Republicans, and they're running on ideas like school choice, and they're getting voted in because of it. So that doesn't make any sense. When have they chosen time and time again? That is nonsense, and it literally, I have no idea where she got that logic from. They've chosen time and time again. When? Can somebody tell me when they chose? I haven't been asked that question. Have you been asked that question? Have you been asked if you're first school choice or not? Have you been asked whether or not public money can go to private schools, despite the fact that public money goes to all kinds of private businesses anyways? But I guess because these public schools are funding, teachers unions and PACs that dump tons of money into Democrats, that's why suddenly they have such a problem with it. But if the money was going into PACs that were dumping money into Democrats, they'd have no problem with private money going to public companies. But anyways, putting that to the side, this is nonsensical. And she goes on like that with nonsense for the next several minutes until she finally, at the end, after a 4-minute speech, talks about why she even mentioned slavery in the first place.
We have lived with slavery in the Constitution. Why not leave the Constitution alone and do what needs to be done for kids today and not a year from today?
Okay, so why is there slavery in the Constitution? She would have you believe that according to the Kentucky Constitution, it's still legal for you to own a slave. It's not. What is in the Kentucky Constitution is actually that slavery is not allowed unless it is for a punishment for a crime. So basically, you can have labor work farms for prisons, like they do in Louisiana and other places. That's what she's talking about. She's like, we've lived with slavery in the Constitution. It isn't slavery. That's exactly not slavery like how she's invoking it. What's in the Constitution is that people can be punished with manual labor when they commit a crime. Instead of freeloading in a jail, they could go work on a farm. That's what's in the Constitution. And we have lived with that in there because there's nothing wrong with it. That is a very reasonable punishment for a crime. In fact, I'd say that should be what we do. You don't want to commit yourself to a life of labor and earning an honest living? Well, as soon as we catch you stealing and doing something illegal, guess what we're going to do? We're going to force you to have a life of honest labor. Then maybe you might learn how to not be a criminal. What a weird thing to bring up. We're talking about school choice. She's talking about slavery. What is going on here? Well, coming up after this, we'll be digging into the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife hoopla. We'll have that after this short break. Back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So you might have seen the headlines about the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, as well as the Horse Racing Commission being shifted over to control of the Agricultural Department and the Ag Commissioner. They're both being done for similar ideas. I think that they're shifting over some power to the Agriculture Commissioner for generally political reasons. I don't, on its surface, think shifting power, though, away from the governor is a bad thing to do, regardless of the motivations behind it, whether it's political or because you believe in checks and balances on government. Because remember, our Constitution, our government is set up to be very executive heavy. Now, Beshear has argued that executive heavy means that the governor should have a lot of leeway, a lot of power, and a lot of control. However, we were not set up with one executive. We were set up with several executives, several constitutional officers. And the more things that we can shift over to other people in the executive branch, specifically the Agricultural Commissioner and the Treasurer, in my opinion, the better. Because you can move things like the Department of Revenue over to the Treasurer. You can move things like some of the agricultural side of things over to the Agriculture Commissioner, and that would make a lot of sense to move those things there. It more falls into their wheelhouse anyways, while at the same time it helps create a check on the governor, not just now, but into the future. So I do think dispersing out power away from the governor makes a lot of sense. Now, when it comes to the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, though, there have been detractors that say it's a bad idea, or is it a good idea? Now, why could it be a good idea? I'm going to make arguments for both sides for you all. I'm a sportsman. Those of you who've listened to the show for a long time know I hunt. I don't really fish a whole lot. I fish occasionally, but not a whole lot. But I do hunt, and I deer hunt, but I also turkey hunt as well. I'm right now, setting up my trip here. Soon for opening weekend. I'll probably go out to Eastern Kentucky. You'll never know where I'm going to go because that is something any good hunter takes to their grave. But anyways, so I am a sportsman. So why I am going to represent both sides here, though. So it could be a good idea because obviously you could have access to more resources. Because think about this, right? Which department of government already deals with things like animal care, animal biologists, horticulture, as far as establishing, because that's something Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife does. They deal with habitat, which deals with the horticultural side of things, growing of things, plants, animals. The Ag Department obviously already has many of experts at their disposal in the Department of Plants and Animals that could see a sharing of some resources with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. And that makes a whole lot of sense. Now, here's why it could be a bad idea. Because a sportsman and hunters and fishers, anglers, sportsmen are normally at odds with the farming community, because a lot of what sportsmen and conservation want to see, they want to see healthy deer herds, healthy turkey herds. They want to see reclaimed habitat and everything else. Well, you could see the farming side of things. Now you have a war of two issues, because right now farmers don't really have any grab over in the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. They have no say-so. But by moving it over to ag, you could be opening up the door for farmers now to have influence over what the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife's rules are. And so if they say, look, deer are destroying our crops too much, or they're being a pest, they're eating too much of my corn, or you could say turkeys are causing issues with my free range chickens, right? So on and so forth. Or also saying, hey, we would love to add on another 100 acres of pasture land that is currently set aside for a wildlife management area. And before, they really didn't have a lot of influence in that department, but now they could. And you could see the farmers now saying, hey, let's adjust our bag limits and allow me to kill things that I'm not normally allowed to kill, or adjust the rules in order to fit with my pest side of things. I mean, I think of specifically things like hawks, for an example, those kinds of things where they could say, look, we have pests going on here. We want to open up the hunting regulations so we can deal with these pests better. So you could see that. And then also, as I mentioned, you could see a shrinkage of available public hunting land if we have farmers that are in the area saying, look, we want to be able to purchase up that land and use it. So it could be good because you're sharing of resources. Could be bad because now there's these other influences. On the Horse Racing Commission, that's being shifted over to under control of the Agriculture Commissioner, while the board members are appointed by the Ag Commissioner but had to be confirmed by the Senate. So that's what's happening there. So why are these shifts of power happening? What is the real story, though? Because obviously it's got nothing to do with streamlining government or saving money or anything else. Well, it really all has to do with politics and Beshear. Part of a Senate power grab, a money grab. So the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, there's this big backstory, and it goes into a number of years. But basically, the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife is supposed to be heavily autonomous. Why? Well, it's one of the few portions of government that is almost completely self-funded. It's funded through things like hunting and fishing licenses, as well as it receives a excise tax that is any hunting or fishing gear that is sold in Kentucky has a excise tax from the wholesaler to the retailer that then gets paid. That's a federal tax that then gets handed back out to the departments of fish and wildlife in these various states to help them fund their conservation efforts within their state. So it doesn't actually pull in any tax dollars from our general fund or anything like that. So if we rewind, though, to a few years ago when the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, there was a big to-do between the commissioner that was rehired of Rick Storm and Beshear, to the point where Beshear even refused to issue his paychecks because the commission who's in charge of hiring the commissioner hired Rick Storm, rehired him, re-signed his contract, and Beshear was really upset about it. And there's a few reasons why. One of them is pretty much pure speculation on my part, but first is money. They have a pot of money at the at the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, and last I heard it was around $50-ish million in reserves. And while that must be spent on fish and wildlife, state parks, things like that, etc., what that actually entails could be blurred a little bit. a new distillery perhaps, wants a nature reserve for patrons to look at while hanging out on their big giant back bar deck that they've built. Well, for a little donation to Bashir, you could get yourself possibly a taxpayer-funded one that the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife maintains and builds for you. And that kind of leads into then the second issue. I think Bashir promised someone Rick Storm's commissioner's job. And I think he promised it to him, and he wasn't able to deliver on that promise, and he's pretty upset about it. And this really, I think, also goes into why the Racing Commission being shifted over to the Senate. And it deals with job placements, board placements. That's one of the number one ways big donors or fundraisers get paid off when they make those investments in campaigns. Give Bashir $100K while he's running for governor through one way or another, and you get on the Horse Racing Commission board, which is a pretty big deal. If you own horses or operate a horse track, I mean, that could pay off pretty big for you to be on that commission. Being the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Commissioner, that could pay off pretty big for somebody if they're in the right position. Or having influence over what they're deciding, that could be a pretty big payoff. So shifting those board members being confirmed from it just being appointed to now being confirmed by the Senate, well, that takes fundraising powers away from the governor's office, not just Bashir, but into the future. The ability to raise funds and promise positions on that very important, powerful board. But in turn, it now takes that away from him and then gives it to the Senate as another way for Senate leadership to fill their coffers. Because now if you want that board placement, instead of giving $100K to Bashir, who do you give it to? Well, you give it to the Senate Caucus Campaign Committee that leadership has control over, that leadership uses to continue to keep control on the members of their body. So I think that's why the shift is going. Is it good? I mean, it does make some logical sense, and it's always great to shift power out of one hand and kind of start to disperse it out a little bit. But the same hand, the reasoning behind it, I think, is highly political. And that goes back to what I said kind of near the beginning. While shifts in power and something can be good or seem good, the reasoning behind it could be awful. And in this case, I think for the Horse Racing Commission, seems fine to me. The reasoning's awful, but it makes sense because the Ag Department has way more to do with horses than, the governor's office does. Like, they're already dealing with agriculture. You might as well give them horses. On Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife is a good thing, is a bad thing. A lot of the sportsmen are against it because of the concern of farmers having more influence over what's going on. We'll see how it plays out. Well, that's what we got time for today and this week. It's already Friday. Can you guys believe that? Well, we'll be back here next week. I hope you all have a great weekend. Until then, I'll be seeing you. If you want to learn more about the show, head on over to theandrewshow.com. We'll be seeing you.